Hi, this is Darlene with Digital Photo Mentor. In this video tutorial, I'm going to explain some common photo editing terms that are often misunderstood or confused. Whether you're a beginner to photo editing or you've been doing it for a while, stick around, you might pick up a few tips. I'm using Lightroom for the purposes of this demonstration, but any photo editing program should have similar or exactly the same terms. So if you're not familiar with the ones that I'm using, check inside the program that you're using. And if you're not sure, just ask me a question in the comment area below and I'll try and help you out. The first term I want to explain is metadata. This is the information that is embedded within your file when you shoot it in the camera. Things such as the time you took it, the exposure information, the camera, the lens that was used, and so on. If your camera has GPS capabilities, it will also record the location if you have that turned on. So the metadata is really helpful later on for helping you to understand and even troubleshoot your images. So for example, you can see this one here was shot in an RAF format, which I'll cover in a moment. That's a Fuji RAW file. And you can see the exposure information was a 1/340th of a second at f5.6 at 160 ISO. And you can see that the lens that was used was the 18-135 Fuji lens at 18.5 millimeters. All that's very helpful if you're trying to figure out later whether something went wrong with your shot, you're trying to troubleshoot it, or even if you just want to know what is the most popular lens that you have that you use most often. Most editing softwares will have some sort of way of reading or looking at that metadata. In Lightroom, I am in the library module. And you can see on the right hand side here, there's a panel for metadata. And there's a bunch of different options that you can choose from this list here, but the EXIF data is the one that will show you. You can see the dimensions of the file, that's in pixels, the date it was created, so the timestamp, the exposure information, and all of the things that I mentioned, including whether or not the flash fired, what shooting mode I used on the camera, what exposure mode, what metering mode, and so on. If you're just beginning to do photography, you're probably shooting in JPEG format. So I want to talk a little bit about file formats in the camera and file formats that you may save your images to later. RAF or a CR2 or other types of dedicated camera RAW files are ones that are unprocessed and uncompressed in the camera, meaning that they carry the most amount of data. I have an article on the website that explains the difference between RAW and JPEG, so I won't get into a lot of detail here. Look for the link to that article below the video. Just know that RAW camera images carry a lot more data and information, and you can process or push them a lot farther. Let me show you an example. This image here was shot in Vietnam and it has a lot of contrast. You'll see that there's very dark areas in the bottom of the cave and under the cave and very bright areas on the other side. Let me just show you the before and after. I did a little bit of processing on this image. So that's what it looked like straight out of camera. With a RAW file, the information in the file, there's lots more data in the shadows and in the highlights than there is in a JPEG. So I've processed this file to pull out some of those details. I have the same image that I shot as a JPEG in the camera to show you the difference. So I'm just going to copy these settings from Lightroom. That allows me to copy all the processing that I've done. Don't worry about these things right now. This is specific to Lightroom. And paste it onto the same JPEG image. Now you'll notice that there's a lot of difference between the two. Okay, so the color has been shifted. There is a lot of detail that's been picked up in the cave, but there's sort of this weird halo thing that started to happen. There's a lot of noise or artifacts occurring that aren't occurring in the RAW file. You'll see that the RAW file is much smoother and there's more data and more information there. Okay? And that is just because of the larger file size, and it is a 16-bit file which carries millions of more colors than a JPEG, which is an 8-bit file. Okay, so that's another sort of subterm of the camera formats or the file formats, JPEG is 8-bit, which means that it carries 2 to the power of 8 colors in each of the RGB, which is red, green, blue. So there's another term that you might have heard, but not sure what that means. So your images are made up of 3 layers, red, green, and blue layers. And when you have an 8-bit file, there's 2 to the power of 8. So 2 times 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 2, 2 to the power of 8 colors in each of those layers, meaning 256 shades of red, green, and blue. When you have a 16-bit file, that's 2 to the power of 16. So it's not double, it's literally millions of colors in each of the layers. So that should give you some idea of how much more information is carried in a RAW file. Now, the catch-22 is that when you shoot a RAW file, you have to process it. You can't share it on Facebook, you can't email it to somebody, and most photo labs don't want you to send them a RAW file either because it's unprocessed. Your camera processes a JPEG based on the picture or style that you have set in the camera, so it applies 3 things: color, saturation, contrast, and sharpness, so that a JPEG that comes out of camera is ready to be used. A RAW file is not, and you must process it. So if you're not currently doing a RAW processing workflow, you would have to make some adjustments to do the shift from JPEG to RAW. So a lot of times I recommend for beginners, if this is where you're at, shoot both for a while, use the JPEGs that you're used to, and then shift gradually over into using RAW. So in the interim, shoot both. Here's one more example of a RAW file that I shot that had a lot of contrast. The original out of camera, the window or the data outside the window was very blown out or overexposed. So I was able to pull a lot of that back using the RAW file. When I tried to do the same thing with the JPEG that the camera took, you can see that it didn't pull quite the same amount of data. It's kind of blocked up and you end up starting to get things that look like just gray. So it's not really carrying the same amount of detail. The other thing that you'll notice is if you go to adjust the white balance, which I'll explain in a moment, on the JPEG, you can see the following options. You can use the white balance as it was shot in the camera, you can do auto, or you can just dial the little dials of sliders up and down here. If you look at the RAW file, these are the options that you have. So all of the camera presets for white balance, such as daylight, cloudy, or tungsten, are still a choice here because the RAW file has all that information included. Carrying on with that same theme, the white balance, you'll see here in Lightroom, it says WB. So that's the same sort of thing that you would set in your camera, and that controls the color tint of your image, right? Does it lean towards yellow or blue or pink, magenta, or green? And you'll notice there's 2 sliders down below here. Temp for temperature, color temperature, and Tint, which is the magenta green scale. So when you adjust the temperature slider, and I'm just going to take it to extremes on both sides so you can see what it does here. When I go to the right and increase it, it warms up the image or adds yellow. And you can see by the slider, by the scale here, it shows you blue on one end and yellow on the other. So this is the color temperature. If you go all the way to the left, you can see how blue it gets. Right? Now let me try the same thing with this JPEG. Okay, you'll notice that now it doesn't have temperature, it just has, or it doesn't have numbers like the Kelvin scale, it just has plus and minus. So if I go all the way to the plus or all the way to the minus, you can see that it's doing a lot more extreme. It's much harder to correct a JPEG that has had the wrong color balance shot in camera, the wrong white balance, than it is a RAW file. RAW files are much easier to correct. A JPEG, sometimes, for example, if you were indoors shooting and you had it on tungsten white balance and then you went outside and all your pictures are really blue, that's really difficult, if not impossible, to correct. And you might as well end up turning them to black and white. I've had to do that myself in the past. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that if you're shooting JPEG, you need to absolutely make sure your white balance is correct in camera. So for the most part, stick with auto white balance and it'll probably get you the closest. If you're using the presets, just make sure to change them and be conscious of that when you change from one scene to another. Something else that will affect the color of your image is a color profile. So that could be a camera profile, or it can be what's called an ICC profile, which is a little bit more advanced editing. Camera profile is something that you may have applied in the camera when you shot it. So for example, I use Fuji. In the Fuji, they're called film styles or film profiles. So when I go into here in Lightroom, the profile is at the top of the basic panel. And if you look at these little 4 squares here, these little thumbnails, if you open it up, you'll see that there's different ones available. Let me just close the histogram. So these are all camera matching. So there's some that come with Adobe and the camera matching ones. So these are Fuji ones like Astia, Provia, and Velvia. So Velvia is vivid. You'll notice that if I just hover the mouse over, it gives me a much more vibrant color and saturation as well as contrast. Right? So just by choosing the different camera profile, you can totally change the color and tone of your image. If you're beginning and new to photo editing, one thing that you might want to consider doing is calibrating your monitor. In order to do monitor calibration, what that means is you have a device like this that plugs into your USB port, and it runs a series of images and colors on your screen. The desired outcome is that it's setting your screen to be as neutral as possible. So that means that if it's gray, it doesn't have a tint of pink or green or yellow or blue. It's completely neutral and void of color. If your screen, for example, is too warm or too yellow, and you send your images to the lab to be printed, they will come out the opposite or blue. The same goes for brightness levels or luminance of your monitor. If your screen brightness is set too high, then your prints are going to come out too dark. So if you've ever had that experience where your prints come back and they don't look like what they do on your screen, it's probably that your monitor is not neutral or calibrated. I'll put a link to this device that I use. It's called the i1 Display X-Rite. It's the Pro one that I use. It will cost you a couple of $100, but it's well worth it if you want to get consistent results with your printing. The next term that you may have heard of before but not totally understand is color space. Color space is the amount of colors. I mentioned earlier 8-bit versus 16-bit. It's along those same lines. So an 8-bit file is sRGB, and you'll see it written like this. And a 16-bit file is usually Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB. What that means is the amount of colors, again, that are inside of your image. So the smallest one being sRGB and the largest one being ProPhoto. ProPhoto is a working color space. You would never have that as your final image that you're saving. Adobe RGB can be printed by some labs, but if you're in the United States, most commonly, most labs use sRGB. So the one thing you want to be careful of when you're saving your images, and let me just open an export dialog box here. So you can see under file settings here in Lightroom, color space is an option when I'm choosing JPEG. Okay, so there you can see the various different ones that I've mentioned. sRGB, they're in order from smallest to largest. Choose sRGB when you are saving for online use or for email. You also want to downsize your files when you're saving them for online. I have a full article about that. I'll link to that below the video as well. If you are working on your files in Photoshop, you can work on them in ProPhoto RGB, but just remember to export in the appropriate file format, whether you're printing or sending it to some source online. Okay, so Adobe RGB or sRGB for printing, depending on your lab, sRGB for online and for email. For working files, always use the largest possible. So that's the same as when you're shooting in camera. You want to use large JPEGs, you want to use large RAW format. Anything that gives you a size option, always choose the biggest and the highest quality, because you can always downsize later. You can't upsize because you can't create data that isn't there. Let's move along and address some more specific actual photo editing terms. The first one I want to look at is cropping and aspect ratio. Again, this is inside of Lightroom, but your photo editing program should have something similar. So you can choose the cropping, and that should be a fairly straightforward term. Cropping is literally just removing some of the pixels. Okay, so if I don't like this bit at the bottom, I can crop in. But you notice that when I'm dragging the little arrows, it's keeping the same proportions, which is called the aspect ratio. The aspect ratio original, most cameras shoot, is 2:3. Okay, so that means that it's the 2 on the short side, 3 on the long side, or 4:6. So if you want to keep it in that original format, you can leave it set to original. You can also choose custom and enter your own dimensions, or you can unlock this in Lightroom and crop however you want. What that means is it's not going to maintain that same 2:3 ratio. I may end up with a square, or if I want something really narrow, you may end up with something that's more tall vertical, or if you're going the other way, a long narrow panoramic. And that's fine too. For this image, I'm going to just quickly correct the tilt because it's slightly crooked, and I don't want to have all this foreground, so I'm just going to crop like that. For me, I crop my image as it's appropriate for that image. So I'm not so worried about keeping the aspect ratio in terms of the original. If you're going to print something, for example, okay, so if I try and print this as an 8:10, okay, now you can see if I choose 8:10 from this menu, it's going to crop a little bit differently. So if you've ever sent an image to the lab and got it cropped back in a weird way, that's possibly why. So if you're ordering an 8:10, use that aspect ratio, and then you'll be able to get a preview and get exactly the crop that you want. You'll notice that if I want to do a 5:7, it's different again. So each of these is a different aspect ratio. If you're working with Instagram, you're going to be wanting like a 1:1. So choose the aspect ratio according to print or where you are going to put it. If you're using it as a Facebook banner, there's specific sizes, and that's where you can go ahead and enter the custom size into here. Right? So most programs will have this option, and then you will get exactly the crop and the size that you need for the destination where you're sending this image. For the next few terms, I'm going to use this image of a grayscale. So on the left is pure black, and on the right is pure white, and each of those is a step up between. So in the basic panel in Lightroom, if you're using Lightroom, again, these terms are similar in other programs as well. They're pretty standard across most photo editing programs. You're going to see some sliders that look like this. Okay, so exposure, contrast, highlight, shadow, whites, and blacks. There's often a lot of confusion, and I've explained this in a lot of my workshops, and I see the light bulb go off with a lot of people as I explain this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what each of these sliders affect. I'm going to turn the histogram on with a purpose, because when I hover over these sliders, I want you to take notice that there's a different section of the histogram that gets highlighted, because that's the part of the graph and the part of the image that is being affected by that slider. So what you'll notice when I put it over blacks, it's only affecting the very far left part of the graph. Okay, so I'm going to drag this all the way to the right and then all the way to the left. Okay, so all the way to the right really isn't doing anything because it's lightening the blacks. All the way to the left is adding more black. Okay, so you see how what it's doing is it's grabbing the edge of the image, the data, and dragging it to the left. Okay, so if you have no black in your image, watch this square here. Watch the third square in, a rectangle. Okay, those are all darkening as I go to the left. So it's starting to pull the blacks off the chart, and it's starting to affect the actual shadow areas. But it's not affecting this half of the graph and this half of the grayscale. Let's try the same thing with whites. When I go to the right, I'm affecting that right side of the graph now and the right side of the scale. When I go the other way, it's darkening. But you'll notice that the left is not being affected that much. A little bit, but not as much. Let me turn on the clipping area. So clipping is another term that you may have heard. So what clipping is showing here in this instance is pure white that has no detail. So that's indicated with the red highlight here in Lightroom, and pure black with no detail, which is indicated with blue. So when you look on the graph, it's going off the chart on either end. So when I drag these sliders now, watch what happens. You see that I'm getting more black clipping when I go that way. And the same thing with the white. I'm getting more white clipping when I go to the right. So sliders in the basic panel to the right are lightening, to the left are darkening. Now let's look at the next pair of sliders, highlights and shadows. Okay, so if I hover over the whites, you'll notice the graph is affecting the far right up the top of the histogram. Shadows now is not quite black, it's just above the black. So if we look at our grayscale, which part do you think it's going to apply to? It's going to apply to the ones next to the black. Let's try. So to the right is lightening, to the left is darkening. So you could see that left of this rectangle here, or right of this rectangle, pardon me, there's not much happening. There's not much effect here. Watch from here to the right. Okay? There's not much change happening. Little bit in this one, but most of the changes are being affected in this area between middle gray and black. Okay, so that's where your shadows lie. Okay, consequently, the same thing applies to highlights. If I drag that to the right, they're going to lighten. Okay, so you see that they're becoming more white. To the right, they're darkening. Now you'll notice that, look what happened. When I drag that down, pure white disappeared. So it's no longer clipping. And up here, you could see that there's nothing going off the edge of the chart as well. Okay? If I try the same thing with whites, it actually doesn't draw the white down below pure white or no detail. So if you find that you have areas of your image that are clipping, play with the highlight slider, not the white slider. Make sure that the whites isn't dragged up because you can still start to clip. If the white slider is higher, make sure that that one is at least set to 0, but play with your highlights because that's going to affect those detail areas more so. When I hover over highlights, you can see that indeed it does affect the area just to the left of pure white on the histogram, and that's what it's doing on the grayscale as well. Exposure. Okay, so now this is a tricky one, and often I will see people adjusting the exposure slider when their image is too dark. And exposure slider really affects the midtones of the image, not the whole exposure. So look at the histogram. You'll see that it's affecting the middle part when I'm putting my mouse over the exposure slider. And let's watch what happens when I drag it to the right. Okay, so you see how it affected everything. I'm not going to go quite so extreme. Okay, so from there to about +2, you see that it's affecting all of those midtones, everything between white and black. And if I go the other way, it's affecting all of the midtones that way to such severe degree that it's affecting the whites if I go as far as the end, and the blacks if I go as far as the other way. Okay, so the exposure slider really affects the tones in the middle of your image. Another pair of terms that are often confused or confusing is the difference between contrast and clarity. So let's take a look at those. Contrast is the difference between light and dark. When you use a contrast adjustment, it's affecting the entire image. So it's basically going to take your histogram and stretch it out from the middle. So watch what happens to the grayscale image and the histogram when I drag the contrast slider to the right. So it's going to increase contrast evenly on both sides. Okay, so you can see that it basically stretched it out. Then I go the other way, everything's coming together. Okay, so there's more compression in the middle, less on the ends. That is not the case when we use clarity. So clarity is looking for edge contrast and the difference between something that's touching something else, one area that's lighter and darker. So if I go higher on clarity, see, it doesn't do the same thing as contrast. It's seeing these edges of these blocks and highlighting them. If I go minus clarity, it's going to start fuzzing those lines. So plus clarity increases the edge contrast of things that already have a difference, and minus clarity lowers that edge contrast. You can also see, if you watch the histogram now, it changes it very differently as well. Okay, so it's shifting the histogram differently than the contrast slider. Let's see how all of these things come into play on an actual image. I've done some editing to this image already. You can see that I've pulled down the highlights. So let me just adjust some of these sliders and you can see in real time what happens when I'm doing it to an actual image. See, same thing happens here. So watch the histogram. It's affecting the far right when I pull the white sliders. It's like it's grabbing the edge of the data and pulling it to the right. So it's not affecting the midtones or the shadows. Okay, same thing applies when I do the blacks. Going to the left, I notice that it includes a lot more contrast now, and the color saturation increased. Okay, and I'm going to come back to saturation and vibrance in a minute. When I increase the blacks, you'll notice that the image becomes sort of flat and lackluster, and you can see that it actually doesn't touch the edge of the graph now. So for me, when I'm editing, I always want to make sure that my blacks are touching the edge of the graph. And there's a quick way to do that in Lightroom, is I hold Shift and double click on the word blacks, and it sets it to what's called a black endpoint. So it's just touching the edge, but not going over. And if you add a little bit more black, you can see how it enhances the contrast. So oftentimes you'll notice that I haven't used the contrast slider at all. If I want to affect my contrast, I can do that with more control using the white and the black sliders. Affecting shadows, darken, lighten, so just as it did on the grayscale, and highlights as well. Okay, so I use the highlight slider a lot to maintain detail in those bright areas. If I wanted more detail in the top of that lion's head right here, that's the highlight slider that I'm going to use. If I turn my clipping on, you can see that if I increase the highlight slider or increase the white slider, I start to get clipping, which means no detail, and I can bring that back by adjusting these sliders. If I adjust exposure, watch the graph again. So now you can really see what it's doing on the histogram. It's literally pulling it from the middle, from one side to the other. So it's affecting the midtones more than anything. There's another way that you can also affect contrast in your image. There's several ways, but this is another common term that is confusing to a lot of beginners, and that is curves. Okay, there's a tone curve inside of Lightroom, and you'll also have a curves adjustment layer if you're using Photoshop. That's common in Luminar and other software as well. So what the tone curve is it's literally drawing a line from the bottom left corner. So imagine this graph. You can see that it kind of looks like the histogram. So if I turn the histogram on, see this sort of faded area in the background here, these spikes, it looks like the histogram in the background. Okay, so this bottom axis is like your histogram. The up and down axis is like your brightness. So the left is black. It's all the way at the bottom or darkest, and the right is white. Now it starts off with a straight line, meaning that it's drawing it directly from black to white. If you want to affect your contrast, if you just grab this line, you could pull it down and it's going to affect the tones in the grayscale. Now notice if I pull it in the middle, it's affecting the midtones, just like exposure. If I go from the bottom end, now I'm affecting the shadows. But you can see that the rest of the curve gets affected slightly as well, which is very representative of what we were doing above with the sliders earlier. So if I want to darken my shadows, but I want to brighten the highlights, you can now do what's called an S-curve. So if you've heard this term before, I'm just going to go to extreme so you can really see it. If you've heard the term S-curve before, look at the shape of this line now. It's gone from a straight line to an S shape. And look at the contrast in the grayscale. So if I turn the curves off and on, you can see that it has a lot more contrast. Okay, so the steeper the S, the more contrast in the image. If I go the other way and make it sort of an inverted S, you're reversing the contrast. Now look at the middle, there's very little difference between a lot of these tones. So you could do some really strange and bizarre and funky things with the curve. You can even start to do things like this and inverting your highlights to become shadows. Okay, this would be more in the experimental realm of photography. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit more about color adjustments. We already talked about white balance, tint, and temperature. There's two more sliders in the basic panel in Lightroom, and these are common, again, throughout all softwares: saturation and vibrance. And there's often a confusion between the two of them and what they do. So let's take a look at extreme. This is a color wheel, and I've chosen this one on purpose because the outer ring is fully saturated and the inner rings get a little bit more faded or desaturated or softer colors, okay? Because your image generally isn't going to be full of highly saturated colors like this. It's going to be a mixture. So let's look at this on how it applies on this example and then on a real image. So saturation is the intensity of color, right? So when we pull the saturation slider all the way to the right, you can see that it's intensifying the color. So what happens is you'll notice that it's applied differently to different colors. So green, yellow, and red, and the magenta, it's applied full saturation to the entire spectrum. But you'll notice, and the cyan one here, you notice a few of the colors haven't gone all the way. So these ones are a little bit softer or muted, and it hasn't applied to them. So saturation really applies the most to colors that are already fairly heavily saturated or color intense. If we go all the way to the other way, of course, you're going to end up with pure black and white, okay? I don't recommend doing your black and white conversion this way because it doesn't give you any way to control the tones. Now let's look at vibrance. So if we take vibrance all the way to the right, it's going to be similar but different than 100% saturation. Okay, now you'll notice that something very similar happened with these colors and these colors, but it's not quite the same. Let's do a comparison. So the image on the right, which is highlighted by the white box, has saturation to 100. The one on the left has vibrance. You can see that they're very similar. There's some differences in the red, some differences in the pinks, and some differences up here in these orange areas. You'll also notice that there's more difference between the yellow and the green here than there is here, as well as in the red tones. Okay, so saturation slider tends to take things more extreme than the vibrance slider. Let's take a look at a real world example. So in this one, if I pull the vibrance all the way up to the right, you'll notice that it's affecting the blues more than anything. Right? And I do find that that's another sort of slight difference, is that vibrance tends to affect cooler colors more so than it does warmer colors, and saturation tends to affect the yellows and the oranges and the pinks as it does here in this sunset versus the other one. You'll also notice that if you go vibrance all the way to the left, you don't get pure black and white. It's kind of close, more of a muted color. So often if you want to play with these two sliders, I will do one up and one down, or the opposite, and see what happens. But if you want to increase your saturation without sort of going over the top, remember what I said about the black slider? If we bring in more blacks, look what happens when I introduce more black to the image, it automatically brings in more contrast. Okay, so when I increase the black and the white, the color saturation goes up naturally. So always do your adjustments up here first in the tones before you do your color adjustments. So let's go back to our little color wheel and the tone curve. Now I only showed you adjusting the basic curve before, which is set to this first one, but you can also affect each individual color separately. So let's see what happens when I do that in the curves. If I just do the main one, so it's going to affect density in the various different tones, just like it did before, but now we're increasing the contrast as well overall, right? If I go into one of the colors, if I pull the slider down, now Photoshop has gotten smart, and Lightroom, this is Lightroom, it's gotten smart and it's actually giving you a preview. So it's showing me when I'm using the red curve, if I pull it up, I'm going to get more red. If I pull it down, I'm going to get the opposite color, which is this cyan color. So more cyan, more red. Okay, so that's really extreme. Okay? But you could do some really fun types of things, like you can make your highlights blue and your shadows red, and so on. And the similar effects happen when you're working with the green. So it's green and magenta. So if you're not sure which is opposite, grab one of these color wheels. There's lots of free ones available on the internet. I can give you a link to one. And then you have a better idea of opposite colors. So blue and yellow are opposite on the color wheel. So when you're playing with the curve, that's how it works to adjust your colors. There are a few more ways to alter the color of your image. The next one I want to talk about is HSL. So HSL stands for Hue, Saturation, and Luminance or Lightness. So I'm going to start with L. So luminance or lightness allows you to adjust individual brightness of the various colors. So what would you expect to happen if I grab the yellow slider, for example, and pull it up to the right? You would expect that anything that is yellow or has yellow in it is going to be affected by brightness. So it's going to get brighter as I go to the right. Okay, notice that the pure yellow is almost white now, but it's also affected the colors right next to it. If I go the other way, we're going to see it darken. The same is true of any of these color sliders. So you could play around with them and really affect tones in your image based on color. Saturation we already talked about, but now you have the ability in this tab to affect the saturation of individual colors. I often will go in and ever so slightly lower the red saturation because I find that sometimes the saturation of reds, it's too intense and it's overpowering. So I might come in and lower it just a few, like -5 or -10. If you have people in your picture, I'll often increase the saturation of the orange and the yellow, which gives them a bit warmer skin tone, a little bit more suntan type of look. You can see what that's doing in here. Similar to luminance, it's affecting all of the colors that have orange in them. The last one is hue. Now this comes back to the tint of the color. So you'll notice that each of these now has sort of a rainbow scale. Let's work on the blue one. So if I shift the blue to the right, it's going to shift it more towards purple. So you can see the colors that are adjacent to blue on the wheel. These are called analogous colors, and they are side by side or next to each other on the color wheel. Ones that are opposite are called complementary. So if you've heard that term before, that's what that means. So when I pull the blue slider to the right, it's going to pull it more towards the purple. When I pull it towards the left, it's pulling those tones more towards the green. So what does all this mean in the real world? Back to my image of the Venice Canal, what it means is I can affect each of these colors separately. So if I want to darken the sky, I can affect blues. You can see that it's not all blue, there's maybe some aqua. So nothing is a pure color. You can see that there's purple in the clouds, and there's probably some magenta in the clouds as well. I can increase the saturation of the blues or increase the saturation to give me more color here. If I want more yellow in the buildings, I can do that. Oh, see, it's more orange. There's also some orange in the sky, which is surprising. So let's go back and affect the sky. So it really allows you to do some specific color shifts. If, for example, I don't like this man's hat or the color of his hat, or maybe he has a red stripe on his shirt, I could affect the tone, the saturation, and the tint using the sliders. Okay, let's just see what color is in his hat. I'm going to guess it's magenta. No. Okay, so there's a lot of purple in his hat. So you can see that by changing purple, I'm affecting the background and his hat. I could lower the saturation if I want to make his hat sort of more gray, and I actually like that. Or I can even shift it to a slightly different color. Okay, so this is how you can affect colors, like somebody's wearing a shirt that's a color you don't like, or something in the background. But do make note that if there was something else in the picture with this same tone, it's going to be affected as well. So you just have to pay attention to what else is going on in your image. Just a quick review, go back into curves. I'm going to apply some adjustments on the grayscale. I'm going to apply red to the shadows and cyan to the highlights, and you can literally see how that is affecting the image. Another way you can add color in various different ways or different areas of your image is in color grading. Now this may be known by a few different terms. You may be using Luminar, and they used to call it a LUT. Now it's under the mood panel if you're using Luminar AI. If you're in Luminar 4, it's called a LUT or lookup table. If you are using an older version of Lightroom, you may see something called split toning. I'm using the latest cloud version, and it's now called color grading. The difference is the split toning used to allow you to affect the shadows and the highlights, and you could just pick a color and dial those up and down. Now you can also affect the midtones as well, so it's gotten a bit more complex and flexible. So what I'm going to show you is kind of a split tone. So you can do that in Lightroom by using these sliders here, or you can go into choose the hue. So I'm going to choose something on the yellow end and give it a little bit of saturation. Okay, so you'll notice that I'm affecting that in the shadow area. I'm on the shadow tab, and then I can go into the highlight area, pick something in the blue, and give it blue. Okay. Then I could even go into the midtones and do something different again if I wanted to add some red or something like that. So you could really sort of create a tritone. So tri would be three different colors. If you want to make like an antique sepia tone or antique sort of like old-time look, what you want to do is choose something that's towards the orange. You can see it's affecting there. And I'm just going to make note of the number here. So I'm at 48 and apply it to both the shadows and the highlights, or just to the shadows. Okay, so I want to have about 48 and maybe a little bit less. Let's go 52. Right, and you can see that if I dial it up, it applies to the highlights here. And if I go to the shadows, I can do the same here. So that will give you that sort of antique brown sepia look to your image. Back in the days of film, we had to actually use chemicals in the darkroom to create such an effect on a black and white print, which were quite hazardous to our health. So I much prefer this method. The last two things I want to cover are a bit more technical as opposed to aesthetic, and that is chromatic aberration and noise. Chromatic aberration is caused generally by extreme wide-angle lenses and usually on the edges of your image. What it means is that it's the inability of the lens to focus all of the colors, the red, green, and blue, at the same point. So you end up with a color fringe. You can see that this was shot with a 17 to 35mm lens. This was an old Tamron lens that I was using on a Canon camera. So these are ones that are typically where you'll find chromatic aberration. Lower quality lenses, kit lenses, especially wide ones, right? So you don't necessarily have to throw all your lenses away if you have this problem. It's quite easily fixed. What it looks like is a color fringe. So you could see it here. Right here on the edge of the building, you see sort of this purple outline and it's ever so subtle green outline over here. To fix it, we just have to go over to the lens corrections panel. And again, most software will have this. In Luminar, it's called Optics in Luminar AI. And literally just check this box off. So watch what happens to this little purple fringe here when I check that off. Okay, do it again. So there's removed, and it's literally that simple. Let's take a look at another spot. As I mentioned, it's usually going to be on the edges, so you can see there's a lot of green happening on the bottom edge. Okay, just with a click, it's removed. On the bird, you can see that there's green on one side and magenta or purple on the other side. Okay, so those opposite colors again. And that's just that failure of the lens to focus all the colors in exactly the same point. And when you do chromatic aberration adjustments like this, it actually will help the sharpness of your image because now it's registering those colors better. Noise is something that I actually just covered in another video. I'll put a link to that one below as well. But a quick example, noise happens when a few things occur. Noise is caused by high ISO. This image, for example, was shot by accident at 25,600 ISO, which is extremely high. But it's also caused by long exposures. So often if you're doing starry skies or long exposures at night, you're going to get some noise as well. And also it's caused by underexposure in the camera and pushing the exposure up in processing. So you may have shot a slow exposure at ISO 100 or 200 and are wondering why you're still getting noise or grain in your image. And what it looks like, okay, so I'm zooming into 300% again, is this sort of speckly appearance. So where you see all these little colored dots and so on, this is what's called noise. So the color noise is where you see all these little pink and green specks. And I'm going to just turn on my noise reduction. So you can see that Lightroom has done a pretty good job, and it's removed the color noise and it's removed the regular noise. Okay, so you can see the difference. So color noise is those color speckles, and the regular noise is all the other artifacts. Right. Noise reduction is something that's a bit more complicated, and as I mentioned, I went into more detail in a previous video. So if you want to know how to remove that from your images, give a watch of that one. If your head is spinning with all these new terms, not to worry, you will get it. Just keep practicing and keep learning. Save this as to your favorites and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video. Until next time, take care, keep shooting, and we'll see you soon.